Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is Friday evening, the 11th of January, 2019. Tonight's topic, Russia dumps the dollar, adds gold, euros, yen, and yuan to reserves. We're going to talk about the de-dollarization efforts of Russia, and we're going to contrast that to China's strategy and what China is doing. You're going to see that the two countries are really pursuing a day and night strategy because their economies are truly day and night. One is debt driven, the other is not. We're going to get into that later on in the show. We've got a lot of news. We've got to go through the gold and silver prices. We have to go through the crypto prices. And so let's get started on what happened in the gold markets, the equity markets, and gold today. Not a good day, not a bad day. Went up a little bit, went down a little bit, and ended, I believe, up a little bit. Let's just check that out here. So gold today, the gold price was just barely positive, up $1.22, up 0.09%, effectively flat. And we're still below that $1,300 level. Did get as high as $1,295, but couldn't go any higher. Now, the stock market today was down most of the day and rallied towards the end of the day to a flat close. We're going to see that in a second. Again, the Trump pump, and the Powell put were probably in play today. Looked like the markets wanted to go lower, were lower most of the day, and then it looked like a little rally into the close and a little painting of the tape at the end to finish flat. Although they were not, I think all three indexes, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, and the Dow Jones Industrials actually had slight point losses, but really were in the range of error for flat. Silver price also up a little bit, managed to gain 4 cents, and had been as high as $15.72. Still not knocking on that $16 door yet, but closed at $15.58. There are no after-hours numbers to give you. These are the final close. We won't see these numbers change until 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday. And after today's price action, what happened to the unsustainable gold-silver ratio? The one that's supposed to be 16-to-1 and 9-to-1 and 1-to-1, because silver is rarer than gold. And we could not leave our lives without silver. And silver is money, period. Well, we're going to talk about silver as a monetary metal. The end of the month with David Morgan in a big debate. David has agreed to debate yours truly, moderated by Kennedy Financial. And we're going to discuss whether silver is a monetary metal. But you can see the gold-silver ratio here, not reflecting much of a monetary component, is at 82.65 to 1. So you need 82.65 ounces of silver to get yourself just 1 ounce of gold. And that leads people to always say, it's a bargain, it's a bargain. And people thought it was a bargain at 70-to-1, 60-to-1, 50-to-1. It's always a bargain, but hasn't gone anywhere in 5 years. Let us move on from gold and silver and look at the equity markets. As I mentioned, Dow Jones just down 5.97 points, which is down 0.02%, really nothing at all. NASDAQ a little bit more of a loss, down 14.5 points, but that was good for just a 0.21% loss. And the S&P 500 was down just 0.38 points to 2596. That was down 0.01%. So they didn't manage to paint the tape into the black, but it did finish slightly below in the red. In other news, in economic news, inflation fell for the first time in 9 months, the way they count it, the CPI, and that was due to the lower gas prices. We did see lower gas prices mostly for December, also in January. It's fluctuating wildly, but still in that 55 to 45 range. So lower energy prices bringing the CPI down. That probably won't have much of an impact on whether the Fed moves or not. They like to see their inflation target creep up higher. If it goes down due to energy issues, they generally discount that as noisy because energy is fluctuating. But still, it probably means that the Fed, given the volatility in the stock market, the meeting of the plunge protection team, Powell's recent statements about patience, I think they're probably in no mood to try to squash nascent inflation by raising interest rates, especially since the stock market is still recovering from the aggressive rate hikes of 2018. Now here's a surprise story for you. HSBC was fined. Now why were they fined? No way. Settled bond rigging lawsuits. $30 million. They just pay that out. And as you know, no one goes to jail. It's just cost of doing business. Who knows how much money they made and what percentage that 30 million is of the profits they made rigging the markets. But it's a $9 trillion government agency market that they were rigging, and they're going to pay their $30 million. HSBC. All right, let's get into now. Today I had, we had discussed this before. I already covered the U.S. Mint gold sales for 2018 and the U.S. Mint silver sales for 2018. And we did full-on podcasts on those. I've published the charts now on the Smaulgld.com website. And today I published the gold charts. I had already published the silver charts. They're up. We're not going to go through them tonight. But what I do want to mention is the 2019 sales so far to date. So right now, according to the U.S. Mint, January sales of American Silver Eagles are at 2.846 million. And we've got another 10 days or so left of selling. So chances are, at that pace, the U.S. Mint might sell 3 or 4 million American Silver Eagles this month. And I've shown you here how prior Januaries have looked. Last year, 2018, 3.25. Looks like we'll probably beat that. So it looks like there's some movement in the silver market, in the silver retail market in the United States. You can see in 2013, biggest record month ever, 7.5 million American Eagles sold. But during the big record year of 2015, 5.5 million American Eagles were sold in January. And then in 2016, the first 4 or 5 months of the year were actually on a record pace, faster than 2015. And they sold nearly 6 million in the month of January. And 2017, 5 million. As we see, 2018, 3.25 million. The other thing you can see is that all the big numbers are clustered since 2010. And that really shows, it wasn't even in 2008 and 9 during the financial crisis there was a lot of silver buying. It was after, as I've been saying, after gold had caught a decent bid and was really moving up in 2010 and 2011, did we see interest in silver. And that interest in silver stayed after the peak of 2011 when the price dropped. They figured, wow, well, if it was worth buying at $25, $35, $45, and $50, we're going to stay the course now that it's at $40, $30, $35, $20, $25, and they bought in record amounts all through 2012, 13, 14, 15, and early parts of 2016. And then it looks like retail investors gave up in 2017, towards the end of 2016, and it seems that buying picked up at the end of 2018. We'll keep a look on it. This is just a January chart. This is not the full charts for the year. Just so I'll quickly show you December American Gold Eagle sales. And you could see last year at the end of December they didn't sell any Gold Eagles. Now so far in January, 32,000 1-ounce gold coins. It's not that much, but it's still better than nothing sold at the end of the year. It looked like the U.S. Mint closed down at the end of the year due to lack of demand. They closed early. Over on the cryptos, let's take a look at the cryptocurrencies and see what the prices are or have been. They're still trading. They trade 24/7. I think one of our subscribers doesn't like that, thinks that's evil. Thinks that people go deranged if the markets never close. I suppose it's like a casino. Casino never closes, so I guess people don't get a chance to go home and catch their wits. They can just stay there and gamble their money away. Maybe that's what he was getting at. Anyway, Bitcoin flat at 36.31. Ethereum at 125.64. That is also flat in the last 24 hours. Bitcoin Cash 129.23. That's down 2%. Litecoin, big loser at 31.75, down 4.19%. Now, a story I've been following a lot is, here Yahoo finally picked up on it, almost 5 new cryptocurrency ATMs installed worldwide each day, data shows, and I think we're up to nearly 4,200. I did a quick check this afternoon, and let's see, what is it? Yep, 4170. This was a few hours ago. Cryptocurrencies, and the Americas, not the Americas, but the United States of America has 2,508 of them, these cryptocurrency ATMs, and Canada is probably another big country with a lot of ATMs, much smaller population. But the bulk of them, if you're going to have a crypto ATM, it's almost inevitably going to have Bitcoin, and the second most likely coin to have is Litecoin in 60% of these machines, and then Ethereum 50%, and I think Dash and Bitcoin Cash are the next ones. So it's a bit of an adoption play there. People buy them. I don't know how much they buy of them, but of course then if they don't invest in anything, if they're not going to trade them for money, they may trade them for goods and services. And in many instances, these things are installed in convenience stores, so they might spend the money back at the convenience shop. Also, France, tobacco stores start selling Bitcoin. They started in January, the beginning of the year. Bitcoin now sold at 6,000 tobacco stores, and they're saying 6,500 by next month. Same concept. People go in, it's curiosity. They buy a bit of Bitcoin, and at some point, I think you're gonna want to get rid of it. It's like having cash in your pocket. You have cash in your phone wallet in the form of Bitcoin, and you spend it. And again, that creates some type of adoption. At least that's the theory. Not sure how many people are going to buy Bitcoin at a tobacco shop in France, but again, it's out there, and we'll see how that goes. All the yellow jackets are saying to buy Bitcoin. Now, over on the wall, there's a little movement on the wall here. Flimsy Graham is encouraging Trump. He seems to be, whether this is theater or not, but ever since the Kavanaugh hearings, he's been very upset, or appearing to be very upset with the Democrats and about how they treated him and how he didn't like the treatment of Kavanaugh during the confirmation hearings. And now he's saying, having met with the Democrats, he's saying they don't want to do anything. He's saying declare an emergency now, build a wall now. And then he's also, and he actually went on a tweet storm. I'm not going to show you all of them, but here's Flimsy again, Flimsy Graham. Mr. President, Democrats not going to work with you in good faith with you. Declare an emergency, build a wall. He's just repeating himself here. He just said that in the other tweet. This was within minutes of the other tweet. Democrats are not going to work in good faith with you. Declare the emergency, build a wall now. President Trump disagrees. He says no emergency yet. No. We're going to give him a little bit of time here. He's saying Congress should do this. This is too simple. It's too basic. But if they can't do it, I will declare a national emergency. Now, we've discussed the dynamics of this negotiation. And when it comes right down to it, it is purely over politics, because it's not over money. It's $5 billion. There's no way with a straight face either Republicans or Democrats could say they're trying to save the taxpayer money by haggling over $5 billion, because you can go through even the continuing resolution and find $5 billion that people would laugh at, that the government even think is spending that kind of money on. So something like the wall, which apparently 65% of the public don't necessarily think there should be a wall, but think there needs to be some type of border security, and an obvious border security, not necessarily fix, but way of creating more border security is indeed some type of barrier, which, of course, all many of the Democrats and Republicans have said in the past, have been in favor of and voted for some type of barrier. So it's not, if you're going to argue over it, it's not about money, and it's not even about whether you want border security or not, because the vast majority of the constituents of both Democrat and Republican congressmen and senators want some type of border security, whether or not it is the wall. However, if you prevent the wall for $5 billion, that's okay if the government isn't shut down. Now, the question is it worth shutting the government down over not funding the wall? Now, you can ask that question of both sides. But at some point, you can just blame each other. But it does come down to, I believe it favors Trump's position. I'm not saying I favor Trump's position. I'm saying the facts and circumstances favor his position, because the longer it goes on, the Democrats are going to have to explain, well, if you're for border security, what is your proposal and how much do you want to spend on it? And it may put them in a position when they talk about drones and they talk about surveillance. But remember, surveillance doesn't stop anything. I mentioned the other night, I've seen many surveillance photos. You see them too online, people committing crimes. Okay, so you catch it on film, but that doesn't really stop anything. So you spend a lot of money on technology, which appears to be the buzzword now, but you don't stop anything. And that could be probably more of a waste of money, because you can probably spend $10, $20 billion on drones flying overhead and centralized commands and so on. So we'll have to see how it plays out, but I think Trump is playing his hand correctly, because if they hold the government closed over $5 billion, then it's clear what they're doing. They just don't want to give Trump a win. But remember, Trump ran on winning that point, which is having a wall. But the Democrats, Schumer and Pelosi, the leadership and most of the Congress people and the senators that ran recently in 2018 didn't run on a platform of shutting down a wall. So they ran on other things like getting, some of them, if they're against the wall, they want to get something for it, like DACA or a DREAM Act, DACA extended or a DREAM Act. And so the longer it goes on and the Democrats don't present a border security alternative, it's going to look like all they're doing is saying the wall's no good, the wall's no good, the wall's ineffective, and it's too expensive. But in today's world of trillion, 19, 21, $22 trillion deficits, arguing over $5 billion is not going to be a big winner. The way they have to win this one is they have to come up with border. And the compromise is, if they had any interest in compromising here, is they would put a certain amount of money towards putting in place where there is a wall, fixing those walls perfectly, and then agreeing to where they think that a fence or wall would be effective, not necessarily over the 100 or 1,000 miles, and then have whatever technology solution they want to have for the rest of it. And that would probably be, and the compromise would be, that budget number would be bigger than $5 billion, would include some money for a wall, but not necessarily for a full wall that covers the 1,000 miles that Trump wants. And that would be a reasonable solution, because you're getting border security. Right now, it's as if border security is either a wall or it's not, but the Democrats are saying you're not going to have a wall, but we're going to have border security. That's not going to make any sense. So I think that's where it's going to head. If not, if they just want to say we're not going to deal with Trump and we're going to try to blame him for everything, then they'll declare the national emergency. And we'll see what happens. All right, other news before we get on to our Russian-China comparison. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now she's still off the court, and she's at home again, working at home. And I'm not sure she's working. I mean, you can run this for a while. You have, from what I know about the law business and the clerk business, is yes, the judges will hear the oral arguments. They don't write the opinions. Their clerks are generally top law students from top law schools, and they work with the justice. They understand her positions, and they write the opinion. So she can hang on and be barely half awake and just understand the gist of what's going on. She can get briefed by her law clerks. She can have discussions. She doesn't have to do much. That's what I'm saying. She's going to be effective. But if it's just a matter of her weighing in and putting her vote down, she can be asleep 18, 20 hours a day and still do her job. However, at some point, I would think that she would want not to deal with all this. So she's probably going to step down at some point. And that has the Democrats in a tizzy, because they know that if she goes, then Trump is going to get a Supreme Court pit, and it's going to be a 6-3. And so you're hearing all these kind of silly, look at this one, Roger Simon. If it were possible, would you subtract 1 day off your life and add it to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life for 1 extra day of good health? No. If just 10,000 people did this, as if it's possible, it would add 27 productive years to her life. Now this is, I know they like the Democrats like the wealth distribution. They're now trying to do health redistribution here, but they haven't figured out a way of transferring your health into Ruth Bader Ginsburg's yet. All right, well, now let's get into our story, our discussion and analysis of the evening, which is Russia dumping the dollar, picking up some euros, some yen, some yuan, and then comparing that to what China is doing. Uh-oh. We got a moron here.
Presenting the distinguished international news commentator and foreign correspondent,
Smaulgld. This has been an extraordinary week in world affairs.
No, I told Hillary Clinton that that's moronic.
That's moronic. All right, I think he's going to run for president too. Now, before we get into the Russia-China thing, let's just lay the land in the United States. It's a story most of us know. The United States has the untenable, unsustainable debt. No two ways about it. There's a $21-22 trillion budget deficit. Budget deficit this year alone will be $1 trillion. Interest rates are moving up. Interest on the debt is high. Dog is going nuts. Listen to that. And the unfunded liabilities are in the uncalculable, but when you Social Security, Medicaid, all the things that you have to throw in there that aren't part of a budget, well, then you're dealing about hundreds of trillions of dollars, and there's probably never enough money to pay for it, and you just have to keep borrowing from yourself, borrowing from others, kicking the can down the road. Clearly, at some point, that all ends. And there's probably no one in government that doesn't believe it'll end. They just don't believe it's going to end now. I remember Obama says, well, that'll be a problem, but not now. Essentially saying, yeah, that might be a problem when I'm gone, but it's not a problem now. So Trump appears to have the same mentality. No politician wants to be there when the whole thing comes crumbling down. And now Fed Chairman Powell, he's very worried about the growing amount of debt. And he was asked at one of these roundtables, but he made a good point. It's not really the Fed's job to rein in the budget. And he says he doesn't take that into account in his short-term and mid-term projections about what Fed policy is going to be. And again, I mean, they are to blame in a sense for adding $4 trillion of debt to the Fed balance sheet, but that's in a sense that kind of money you owe to yourself. That's more inflationary than an issue about having to pay it back, because they could just let that stuff roll off. But the point is that the United States has a clear debt issue. So does the European Union, and as we'll see in a minute, so does China. The whole world has a massive debt issue. It's how the 2008 crisis was fixed. At the sovereign debt level, they all printed money. China printed the most. The United States, at one point, had printed the most. I think they've been surpassed by Europe. The ECB is doing QE now. Their QE is over $5 trillion. The U.S. only did $4 trillion. U.S. is trying to knock that down. Japan did QE the minute the U.S. stopped its QE. They've been stagnant ever since. And what's obvious in a debt-driven bubble is you get a lot of bang for the buck initially. You bring all that demand forward when you borrow money, and you get a lot of economic activity. But at some point, you continue to borrow money. You get diminishing returns until you're borrowing 2 times the money to get $2 worth of money to get $1 worth of GDP, then you're really hosed, because you need the GDP and the tax revenues you're going to get from that to pay back the past money that you borrowed. And if you're just extending what you owe by creating more liabilities, by expanding benefits, welfare, food stamps, housing, whatever it is, healthcare, then you're never going to be able to pay it back. All right, so that's the lay of the land. But Russia, actually, we're going to take a look here. The de-dollarization that they're doing is, to me, less important, but it's part of what they're doing. I think they'd be doing what they're doing even if they weren't de-dollarizing, but de-dollarizing is accelerating their plans. So what they're doing, Russia's economy is not debt-driven. It is not consumer-driven. It's somewhat productively driven, not that they're the most productive country, but they are now exporting a lot of oil and agricultural products. And the agricultural products are a new dimension to their economy, because they used to be an economy that used to have to import most of its food, a lot of it from the United States. They had the great grain robbery back in the 70s, where they arranged to buy a lot of grain from the United States at lower prices, causing U.S. food prices to rise. But they've recently learned how to do agricultural, big agro business, organic growing, and so on. So their economy is not that bad off, especially, though, given that they've been under sanctions, a series of sanctions, for the last 5-7 years over Syria or whatever, invading Crimea. Not going to get into the politics of that. The point is, though, Russia has had to tighten the belts in, and because they don't have free reign. Now, Russia's never had big trade, other than that big grain deal I was mentioning. I was back in the 70s during the Soviet Union. Has never had a lot of trade with Los Estados Unidos. They have never worked a lot with the United States on trade. They are not contingent on their economy, on selling stuff to the United States. They export regionally. They export their foodstuffs to European Union, some of their natural gas to the European Union, oil throughout the world. They've reinstituted some trade with China, Japan, but they're not dependent on the United States for their economy at all. However, they are, like any country, dependent, or have been dependent, on the SWIFT system, the dollar system, just because the rest of the world trades in dollars, trades on that SWIFT system, and it's been kind of hard to avoid that type of sanction, because even though you don't trade with the U.S., everyone else trades with the U.S., everyone else holds on to their currencies in U.S. dollars. So Russia was no different. Let's take a look at this chart here. This is January 2000, and that's actually 16, not 15. Or is it 16? No, it's 2016. Their reserve assets. They've managed to increase their overall reserves up to $462 billion. That's a lot of money. And that's the 10th largest reserves in the world. And I think Russia's either the 8th or the 9th or the 10th largest economy in the world. And you can see they've managed to grow their reserves even though they've been under sanctions. That's quite a feat. Now, let's look at the composition of those reserves, and that's what's the interesting point here. This one goes through April, but you can see here, there have been people have been saying Russia and China are dumping the dollar. They never were, but now they are. Well, now Russia is, not China. If you can see here, the yellow is gold, obviously. The green is the dollar. This is from 2016, the same time period we were just looking at. Russia used to have 100, 108, 75, 85 billion dollars in U.S. treasuries at any given point during this time period. And then in April, it dropped down to 48, and then in May, it dropped down to 13. It's not on this chart. And right now, it looks like Russia at least held on its balance sheet at the Russian, the National Bank of the Federation of Russia, has maybe 10, $15 billion worth of U.S. treasuries. So while Russia can't harm the United States by dumping treasuries, it doesn't have them at all, so it doesn't need to have them. There's a big difference between Russia inflicting pain on the U.S., which it really can't do in that sense, but what it can do is it can make itself self-sufficient by reducing its reliance on the U.S. dollar, which it looks like it's pretty much done now. Because now, as far as reserves go, the Russian central bank has about $82 billion in gold, and that number continues to increase, and it's about 18% of overall reserves. And their dollar reserves, now remember, you don't have to have dollar reserves just in U.S. treasuries. Their dollar reserves, though, have been cut in half from about $200 billion. They still have $100 billion in dollar reserves, but of that, only 13 or 15 billion are in treasuries. The rest are in dollars or dollar-denominated assets. But let's just see what's also going on with gold here. And you can see they now have the 2,100 tons. They now rank, and you can see they've been doing this gold acquisition thing now pretty much since the financial crisis, and really ramping it up the last couple of years, last 4 or 5 years, over 200 tons added each year. Again, it's only about $85 billion worth, but add that to the other 360 billion in other reserves, and they've got a decent amount of reserves. They got 60 billion dollars reserves. Now, the reserves that they have, they've moved from, they've shed 100 billion in dollars, and they upped their euros up another 25 billion. So they now have more euro reserves than they have dollar reserves. Now, in the world, in central banks, the dollar reserves are about 63%, and the euro reserves are about 30%, and then everything else is just mixed, and the Chinese yuan is like 1 or less than 2%. And then there's some people have, central banks have some yen, some Swiss francs, some Australian dollars, some Canadian dollars. Those are the big ones. But it's really the dollar and the euro, the major reserve holdings of central banks, and then gold is in there as well. Well, as we've seen, they now have almost equal amounts of US dollars as gold. They still have more dollars than gold in overall, although they have far fewer treasuries than gold. But they have 100 billion left of dollar reserves, and they've got about 80 some odd billion worth of gold reserves. The euro's gone from 100 billion in reserves to 125 billion. And then they've boosted their yuan holdings from about 25 billion to 75 billion. That makes them probably the largest holder of yuan as reserves, because the yuan is not a good reserve asset. Just because of the Chinese economy, the lack of transparency, the ability of China to devalue the yuan. But since if you're going to have trade with China a lot, then it might make sense for Russia to have that amount of yuan. So they've readjusted, and they've also added some Japanese yen to their reserves. So Chinese yuan now is about 15% of their total holdings, which puts it less than gold, but that's a very steep amount of yuan for the central bank to have. I'm not sure they want to go much higher than that. They've got 101 billion worth of dollars, and then they've got a little bit of yen. Now, back in November, Vladimir Putin said, "We're not ditching dollar. Dollar is ditching us." He said the instability of dollar payments is creating a desire for many global economies to find alternative reserve currencies and create settlement systems independent of the dollar. We're not the only ones doing it, believe me. That's what he says. That is from a recent Bloomberg article. Now, also, the article that I just quoted mentions that Russia may also have moved, and China does this as well. I don't know why they do this, but they also hold U.S. treasuries in proxy accounts in other nations, mostly the Cayman Islands and Belgium. As you can see there, that they're holding them there. They're not in the central bank. And you can see the treasuries held at the Cayman Islands. I mean, the Cayman Islands themselves, they don't hold anything. It's not like the government of the Cayman Islands holds $208 billion worth of treasury. Same with Belgium. They don't hold $169 billion as of October. But you can see those numbers increasing, and they do correspond with the decrease in the U.S. treasuries held by Russia. So it's possible that that $100 billion that they still own, maybe they've sold some of the U.S. treasuries, and they have some U.S. cash, and they've moved some of it to the Caymans or Belgium. But the point is that the U.S. dollar holdings have gone from $200 billion, of which about $100 billion were in treasuries, and now they're down just to about $100 billion total in U.S. dollar holdings. But some suspect that some of this has been moved over to the Cayman Islands or to Belgium. Excuse me. We know China used to do that as well, and we used to track the movements of the holdings of Belgium and the Cayman Islands. All right, so that's the overview of the financial state of Russia. Now, Russia, in terms of external debt, has $467 billion. Well, we just saw that they have about $467 billion in reserves. So, even if, and this is not going to happen, all of their foreign debt was called in, they could pay it. That's not how debt works. It doesn't all get called at once. But the point is, they actually have the reserves to pay their external debt. There's not many countries, I think, that can say that. The ruble is a horrific currency. It's not like they could ever say, well, we'll just print up the rubles and pay it. No. The ruble, they don't owe it in rubles anyway. And if they had to print rubles to get the dollars or whatever currencies they may owe their debts in, that would devalue the ruble even more. So it makes sense that what Russia does, we talk about this when we report on Russian gold reserves, why they add gold so much, is not so much a de-dollarization. It's not like they are selling dollars and buying gold. The gold acquisitions are occurring independent. What they're doing is they're buying gold from their own mines through the Russian banks and adding it to reserves, because think of all the gold they've bought in the last 3 years. If they had just held on to that in rubles, their reserves would be like $200 billion instead of $460 billion. But instead, they converted the rubles into gold, and they help their own mines out, and then that keeps those mines productive, and then they can sell the 1/3 or 20% of the gold that they don't buy and put in their balance sheet. They can sell that to China or India, which is what they do. So they have a healthy mining industry that's supported by the central bank's need to buy gold. And while it doesn't help the ruble, it helps in that you can convert your rubles at least into gold, and your balance sheet can be boosted with gold instead of having to buy dollars. So we're seeing a lot of adding of gold, no slowing down of that for Russia. And of course, the Russian central bank now has, as we've seen, the 5th largest gold hoard of central banks. They're now, in the next couple of years, they will probably be in 3rd place, right behind Germany. They'll pass France and they'll pass Italy. Why? Because Italy and France don't add gold to reserves anymore. Germany actually sells 4 or 5 tons of gold every year and has done since the year 2000. And that's because they sell it to their own government so they can mint coins. Now you would think that they would replace that gold, but they don't. You would think the United States would add gold to reserves. They don't. You'd think Switzerland sold 60% of their gold. They used to have almost 2,000 tons. That they would add gold to reserves, but they don't. Japan doesn't add any. The Netherlands hasn't added any. Only India, which used to have 557 tons of gold for the longest time, hadn't added gold in the last 10 years, and finally, the last 3 months, they've added another 20, 30 tons of gold. But for the most part, the top gold holding nations, other than Russia and China, aren't adding gold. And in fact, China hasn't added gold. Now remember, we're talking about the People's Bank of China. We're not talking about Chinese government. We're not talking about Chinese entities, state-owned banks, subsidiary banks of the PBOC, partially owned or wholly owned, individuals in China. Just like in India, that 580 tons doesn't reflect all the gold in India, it just reflects the gold on the central bank. And that's the one that they conduct their official business out of. Now, China could bring in some of the gold at other state-owned enterprises, I'm sure, and they can boost that number if they wanted to. So, to summarize Russia, before we move on to China, Russia has limited external debt, has a healthy reserve position in cash and in yen and in dollars and in euro and in gold, and also has some yuan, 15%, has little trade with the United States, is not a consumer economy, and is export driven mostly in oil and agriculture. Now, moving over to China, you got the exact opposite situation. You've got China right now in a battle with the United States, and that's over a tariff. And China is not a simple economy. It's a much larger economy. It's a much larger population than Russia. It has issues with converting its economy, managing the speed and the growth of its economy. It has these new tariffs. Everything is centrally planned. They have moved hundreds of millions of people from the countryside into the cities. They have built infrastructure that they don't need, that if they didn't build any more for the next 40 years and they grew into it, they could stop right now. They realize they have to continue to build stuff they don't need. And then what they've done is they've gone off on this Belt and Road thing, and they figure, well, we'll do the same thing we do in our country, which is lend. Well, let's do what they do in their own country. The People's Bank of China tells the state-owned banks to lend money to state-owned enterprises to build whatever. They're not necessarily concerned that whatever they build is going to be productive and be able to make a profit for the state-owned enterprise so that the state-owned enterprise can pay back the state-owned bank. And what happens then? Well, it doesn't really matter, because what they want to do is they're trying to create growth so people have jobs, people have cash, people get rich, and so on. And then when the monies don't come back from the projects, the People's Bank of China tells the state-owned banks, forget about it, extend the loan them more money, convert the money into equity, start a new project, do what you got to do. Basically, they tell them don't default on, don't call in the loan and have them bankrupt. So even by the Chinese own internal numbers, some of their industries have non-performing loans of 20, 30, 40, maybe even higher. And they've realized, I think it was like a year and a half ago, the People's Bank of China was saying, look, we realized that we might have reached a Minsky moment. We can't keep doing this debt thing. We're going to have to, just like any heroin addict, we can't just keep taking the drugs. We got to start slowing down, because if we don't, we're going to crash. And they started talking about deleveraging. That was the big key word. And then Trump hit them with tariffs. Well, they were counting on deleveraging because I would imagine their most profitable portion of their economy comes from exporting goods to Europe and the United States. I'm sure maybe not all of it is profitable, and some of it might be make work, and they figure they can just dump products and still keep people working. But I'm sure they make money net on what they do in trade to Europe and the United States, and they probably pick up some money on tariffs on the way in. And when Trump slapped the tariffs on them, they realized that a lot of those state-owned enterprises would be hurt, so they decided they were going to have to give them tax subsidies. They might have to give them subsidies. They might have to forgive loans if they can't pay them back. But then also, they realized that in order to grow the economy, they'd have to go back to do more infrastructure. And they realized that they can't build another 140-story buildings anymore. There's probably no bridges they need building or railway projects they need to build. So they decided that they would do a local infrastructure and parking lots and things like that. But the point being is they abandoned the idea of deleveraging because they realized if they tried deleveraging, it was going to be hard enough at the current planned rate of income they were going to get from the United States. Now they're not going to get that, and they got to go back to the old infrastructure. And we saw last night, we had a story about where the People's Bank of China was wondering whether they get more bang for their buck in buying stocks just to boost them, the old Fed thing, raise the asset prices, people feel rich, or whether they should just build more rails. Now, the other thing they want to do is they figure they can make it up. They could take their model and build stuff overseas on the same non-economic model, but on the if we build it, they'll come, maybe, and maybe we'll get a return on it if we build it. But if not, you'll be on the hook for the money that you borrow from us, and then we own the railway, or we'll own the port, or we'll own the bridge. And a lot of countries have caught on to that idea. They realize that that's nothing more than economic colonialism. We're seeing issues in Belt and Road and Malaysia canceling rail projects, saying they don't think it's going to work. Wholescale just canceled a lot of Belt and Road projects in Malaysia. Kenya's having issues, reported yesterday, with wanting to get out of some of these deals. They're starting to feel, there's been a lot of reports that the Belt and Road is nothing more than a way of indebting foreign nations and getting their assets by lending them money. Now, again, if these countries really needed these infrastructure projects, then maybe money would be available to them. But it's when someone comes and says, I'll build this for you, and then, what does a politician know other than a bribe? They say, well, yeah, okay, let's do it. But maybe there's no need for some of these projects. And yes, there's need for infrastructure. The whole world doesn't have the same infrastructure that other parts of the developed world have, but maybe there's market reasons why they don't. But if you just go in and say, we'll build it and we'll get you up to speed just like everybody else, what's it going to cost? Don't worry about it. You never know what's going to happen. So there is some issues with China. And again, Russia's not involved in that kind of thing. So China is trying to manage its international relationships, its international profile, so that people can understand what China is, so that when China comes, they understand what's coming. And it seems like the world is catching on to hold on to your wallet. Now, the other thing that's happening in China is, we saw this one, iPhone sales are down in China. That's strange. They make them there. Well, the Chinese consumer had been, the last 10 years, one of the savings graces, just like in Japan, is at least the people save money. Well, that's stopped. The people in China now borrow money. They borrow money to buy houses and second houses and consumer items. And that was one of the things, I think one of the plans for China, in a sense, was to become more like the United States. Great model, right? You export all your exporting, you let other people make the stuff, and then you become a consumer-driven economy, and you get richer letting other people work, and then by borrowing money to buy stuff that you don't need at home. Well, somehow it looks like the Chinese are not being able to pay for these iPhones. So is it the question that they can't afford them? And I bet they're at the same position. They've racked up debt as consumer debt, thinking that these good times, a GDP of 10 and 12% would last forever, and that their jobs will continue to exist and continue to get paid higher wages, and maybe that's no longer the case. So retailers are slashing iPhone prices across China as consumer says phones aren't worth the cost. That's like somebody saying luxury items cost is generally not an issue. You don't say $280,000 for a Lambo or a Ferrari, not worth the money. No, if you have a few $1 million, you don't really think of it that way, I'd imagine. So I'd imagine that the Chinese consumer is also tapped out as a result of all this. Now, let's look at the Chinese position on U.S. treasuries. The whole China dumping treasuries is false. China and the United States, unlike Russia and the United States, are intricately linked in their economies. The United States needs the cheap goods, all those white goods, those toasters, those freezers, those washing machines, the dryers, the stoves, the clothes. And China gets dollars for all that stuff. In fact, China runs on dollars. Their state-owned enterprises often loan money in dollars. China has $1.7 trillion in external debt. Remember, Russia only had 467, and they had 467 billion approximately in reserves. Well, China does have 1.14 trillion in treasuries. Doesn't look like they're anytime soon going to be dumping those. But let's take a look at Chinese foreign reserves. They were once over $4 trillion. They've sold off about $1 trillion worth of reserves. Are at about $3 trillion right now. But China has about 45, 50, 60 trillion in internal debt. And who knows what their unfunded liabilities are. I mean, are they not going to pay pensions to retiring Chinese workers? Don't they have Social Security unfunded liabilities that are unsustainable? I would bet they do, and I would bet they owe even more than the United States has, simply by the fact they have 4 times the number of people. And I think that's all we have on China. So before we get to the comments, the only point left is really just to recap, is that China is a debtor nation. China is productive, but China has a lot of infrastructure that they've produced that isn't productive, meaning that they're not going to get their money back on that stuff. And Russia is productive, maybe not as productive, but it's not a consumer-driven economy. It's not a debt-driven economy. And they can de-dollarize, whereas China could only dream of de-dollarizing because they are, in a sense, locked into the dollar system. For them, Russia seems to have already gotten out. For China to get out would cause them enormous turmoil, and they really can't afford turmoil because they have to keep the wheels on the train going. They can't afford to have a collapse, so to speak, and have, you know, we had Tiananmen Square back in 1989. They can't have that again. So I don't think they're going to be de-dollarizing. They're going to try to deleverage. I don't think they're going to do that. So I think this whole thing globally is going to go, the United States and China are just going to see who can continue to borrow money and get away with it until it collapses. My bet is on the U.S. I think the U.S. can borrow more money than China can. But we'll see. Let's see what you guys think. All right. Andrew, what do you think about the 12 billion Bitcoin buy by Russia leak? I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure Russia would do that with the reserves right now. I don't think any central bank would buy any significant amount of Bitcoin at this point. All right. Send me big on what that is. De La Ville says hello. And Holloman is here. By the way, if you're listening and you don't know what I'm doing, at the end of each of the monologues that I do, I go back and I read all the comments that happened during the podcast. And I read them, and if they're relevant, I try to answer them. Most of it's a lot of people talking to each other. I generally don't comment on that. All right. Let's see. Everyone's saying hello. I'm going to miss all that. All right. You guys are talking about just another news story today that people are talking about in the chat. Is Bezos getting divorced to his wife? And I think he's worth like 146 billion. So maybe she gets half of that. All right. Let's see. MK Herney. So the Yellow Vests in France are planning a run on the banks tomorrow. I heard something about that. I don't know what good. You know, when you have money in the bank and you do a run on the bank and you agree with everybody else to do a run on the bank, you're ensuring that you won't get your money. Because if you really want to get your money out of the bank, you don't tell anyone. You go and get it. Then you don't really care. But, yeah, I don't know if they're going to do that or not. Yeah, MK Hearn says $5 billion, less than 5 days of interest on the $22 trillion in national debt. I mean, that's the point on the wall. It's not the money they're arguing over. Well, then you can argue it's not effective. And they say, okay, assuming you're in favor of border security, which 65-70% of people are, then how do you secure the border? Come up with something better and cheaper. And I think, as I mentioned, you'll probably have something in between. All right. Pablo Pina, QAnon, Q my mug, says the shutdown is not because of the wall. Yeah. It's going to take decades to build a wall. Totally manufactured crisis. Well, totally manufactured crisis is that's just a code word. Now, actually, all presidents have said there's a crisis on the southern border. Obama, they've all said it. Now, the issue is whether it's what you call an imminent crisis. Because whatever crisis is, the argument is, okay, well, if it was a crisis, Trump, why didn't you do something about it the first year, the second year? Why do you wait to now? So to that extent, it is manufactured by raising its profile. But the crisis has always existed based on what happens is that people can come over the border. You can always say that if you can't protect the border, it's a crisis. Whether you decide to do anything about it doesn't mean there's a crisis or not a crisis. You can have, your roof could leak. And you can live in the house, and you can have a leaking roof, and that would be a house crisis. And you can not do anything about it for 2 years. And finally say, damn it, I'm going to fix the roof. And your spouse says, why? And you say, because it's a crisis. You say, well, why didn't you do something about it 2 years ago? That doesn't negate the fact that the roof is leaking. So I'm not sure that that's a valid argument that it's a manufactured crisis. The question is, all sides have agreed that they want to secure the border. Now the crisis is, the manufactured crisis is, that they're going to fight over it as if the $5 billion for the wall matters. That's the manufactured crisis. All right. And Holloman throwing out the swear words. But they're not getting shown, so don't worry about it. They did some testing. Yes, they could be sailed through. We live in dumb times. Yeah, but remember, if you have a caravan, and by the way, if you're gonna, you can always break through. But that's like saying your door shouldn't be locked because someone could kick it in. But just what you're actually arguing for when you say that the steel slats don't work, then you're arguing for a more secure structure. So it's not LOL that they could be sold through. Actually, the LOL was Jim Acosta going down to the border and saying, I don't see any crisis, while he's standing in front of a wall. He says, I don't see people trying to get over this. All right, let's see. What else do we got here? Herb Levin. Haven't seen Herb in a while. What's he got to say? They're going to prop up Ginsburg like weekend at Bernie's, trying to keep from getting another pick. Yeah, there is that potential there, because as I mentioned, you know, the Supreme Court justice doesn't even have to be, and sometimes there's plenty of examples of very effective judges who just sit silent during oral arguments. They don't care. They listen. They let the other judges ask all the hard questions, and they're the ones who are paying attention, and they're just listening. They don't have to comment. She could just sit there and listen, and then she could just go to her law clerks and say, I agree with the position of this and this and this and this. And I think it's based on these 3 laws. So go do the research and write up an opinion, either majority opinion, concurring opinion, dissenting opinion. So yeah, she can hang on that way. That is for true. Ace. Wow. Listen to this, Ace. You are not allowed to your message is held for review because you used the word libtard. Now that's pretty strict. There's not a swear word there. Unbelievable. So that message doesn't get read. The word retard and libtard, those words get flagged. Like there's something, there is a word, you can retard mold growth with BHT. I guess libtard is probably offensive, I suppose. GOP loves spending in debt. No. Politicians love spending in debt. China loves spending in debt. Dems love spending in debt. Presidents love spending in debt. Anyone who wants to get reelected loves spending in debt. All right. Fact. Let's see. Where are we? Pablo. Everybody's saying hello to each other. Pablo Pena. Which mug did he get, Seth? He got the classic. Did you get the classic or the super classic? I don't remember. All right. Seth says the mug is really nice. Yes, let me show you guys. We got to get some mug sales in. It's Friday night. If you're sitting there and you don't have a mug in front of you, you have to go get it. And if you don't have one, you have to go buy one. And you need to go to Smaulgld.com and get yourself a Smaulgld mug, because they are truly game changers. You've seen the mug shots. Now pick one of them. Now, let me show you another one. There's the Smaulgld Super Classic. You can order that one right away. You can order that right now. All right. So they dump the dollar, buy euros. Will get their clock cleaned. Yeah, Shark Air stuff. So they dump the dollar and buy euros. They will get their clock cleaned. Yeah, but I think at this point, remember, when you're holding reserves, they can move them around too. And again, they don't have... It's actually very smart the way they've moved around their reserves. They don't have more than 20% in gold, not more than 15% in Yuan, not more than 20% in euro. So they've got stuff. I don't think they're buying Bitcoin though, Ian. That's just the story. I don't think they're buying Bitcoin. They'd have to report it. They haven't reported it. Yeah, they're buying mugs too. All right, let's see. All right, Putin did a good job for this country. What's this? All right, Yellow Vest, Snowden. Ann says West is king now. De La Ville says U.S. had their hand in that throughout history. Putin lived through it as a young man trying to bring the country back. I don't know what that refers to. What does that refer to? Did I miss something? Oh, the Tsar heritage. Okay. Ace, not for long, and the power and wealth are flowing east. Russian interest rate 7.5%. Yeah. It means no one wants to lend Russia money. Let's see. It's propaganda, says Ace. No one wants to attack Russia. They have 7,000 nukes. What's propaganda? I agree. No one wants to attack Russia, that they have nukes. But what's propaganda? All right. Let's see. You guys having a discussion. Chinese are realizing iPhones are spy devices. Well, they make them there, so they would know, where's Barry, what's in those devices. And their own devices have spy devices in them too, so who knows? All right, I think we're running to the end of the comments here. Yep, that's it, I believe. So there's really only one thing you have to do is you have to go and order your Smaulgld mugs. Let me give you this. You can also become a Smaulgld patron when you go to the Smaulgld site. I am looking to pick up some patrons tonight too. I think I lost one the other day. I had a $1 patron who canceled on me. So I'm now below 20. I need to get actually a lot more. But the goal for tonight is to get back to 20. To at least have a round number of patrons. In fact, I'll make it easy for you since you've all been very good sticking with me. I'll leave you the link directly so you don't have to even go to the Smaulgld site. You can just sign up at Smaulgld. I do appreciate that at the patron. And anything else tonight before I sign off? And if not, I really want to thank everyone for joining me tonight and all the nights that you have been joining me. And I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow night is Saturday Night Silver with Smaulgld. If you have any topics regarding silver, we cover silver exclusively on Saturday night. Now remember, we do have the upcoming debate with David Morgan, the silver guru, but that's at the end of the month, so we'll hold off on that. Okay, thank you very much, and good night.